Standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive office in Seattle, I watched the thick gray fog swallow the Space Needle while the cold reality of my destruction waited patiently behind me. My name is Vivian Vance. I am 45 years old, and until 10 minutes ago, I was the undisputed visionary behind the billion-dollar empire known as Vance Organics. The heavy silence of the boardroom felt like a physical weight as I turned to face the semicircle of shareholders who had once pledged their absolute loyalty to my dream. I stared at the legal documents spread across the mahogany table while my husband leaned forward with a predatory smile that stripped away 15 years of shared history in a single second. He calmly announced that every one of my personal bank accounts had been frozen under a temporary court order, effectively paralyzing my ability to fight back against this corporate execution. Beside him, my cousin smirked as she slid a resignation letter toward me, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, while she called me a relic of the past who no longer had a place in the future of this industry. The room seemed to shrink when they whispered the ultimate ultimatum, threatening to use my sudden financial instability as leverage to strip me of my parental rights and take my young son Leo away forever. I felt the sharp sting of betrayal from the family members who sat in complicit silence, yet they had no idea that beneath my trembling hands, I was already beginning to weave a web of retribution that would eventually leave them with nothing but the dust of their own greed. If you want to witness how I transform this total devastation into a masterful blueprint for justice, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter of this journey. Your support helps me share these powerful lessons of resilience and strategic survival, and I promise the ending of this story will leave you breathless. Long before the cold betrayal in that boardroom became my reality, the journey began in a cramped kitchen where the smell of fermenting organic cultures filled every corner of my small apartment. I spent countless nights experimenting with sustainable food technology, while the rest of the world slept driven by a stubborn belief that I could revolutionize how people consumed nutrients without destroying the planet. The early days were defined by a relentless series of rejections from suit-wearing investors in downtown Seattle, who viewed my ambitious ideas as nothing more than a woman's expensive hobby. They frequently questioned my technical expertise during high-stakes meetings and suggested that I should find a more traditional career path instead of trying to disrupt a male-dominated industry. Everything started to shift when I met my husband, Grant Sterling, who was then a sharp and hungry young attorney with a reputation for winning impossible intellectual property cases. He possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the complex legal labyrinths of patent law and spent weeks helping me secure the foundational technology that eventually became our first major breakthrough. Grant seemed genuinely captivated by my vision during those late-night strategy sessions, and often promised that we would build a legacy together that the world could never ignore. His initial support felt like a solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty, providing the legal protection I needed to finally launch Vance Organics as a legitimate contender in the biofood sector. We celebrated our first small office with a cheap bottle of champagne on the floor, making silent vows to protect our dreams regardless of the obstacles that lay ahead of us. The true transformation of our business coincided with the birth of my son Leo, whose arrival marked the beginning of our most explosive period of growth in the competitive market. As I balanced the demands of early motherhood with the pressure of managing a rapidly expanding team, the company suddenly gained massive traction and achieved unicorn status within 18 months. Grant took advantage of this momentum to suggest that we should consolidate our growing personal assets into a single family trust for the sake of long-term tax optimization. He spoke with such convincing warmth about protecting Leo's future inheritance that I never questioned the underlying implications of merging my hard-earned wealth with his legal control. I trusted his professional judgment implicitly because he had been my most loyal advocate during the difficult years when nobody else believed in the potential of my inventions. During a prestigious economic summit in the city, I had the unexpected fortune of meeting a formidable woman named Genevieve, who was a legendary figure in international shipping and a silent powerhouse in global finance. She observed my interactions with the media from a distance before approaching me with a piece of advice that would eventually become my most vital lifeline. Genevieve recognized a familiar spark of defiance in my eyes and offered to become a discreet mentor guiding me through the treacherous waters of corporate politics that few women ever successfully navigated. We began meeting for private dinners in secluded corners of the city, where she taught me how to read the subtle shifts in power dynamics and the importance of maintaining an invisible safety net. She often reminded me that even the closest allies could become liabilities when the stakes grew high enough to tempt their inherent greed. As our company's valuation soared into the billions, Grant began to exhibit a subtle but persistent need for total control over our administrative structure and board appointments. He quietly manipulated our corporate bylaws under the guise of strengthening our defenses against hostile takeovers, while I was preoccupied with overseeing our global research and development. I remained tragically unaware that he was secretly altering the voting rights within our governing documents to give himself the final say in any major structural changes. My absolute faith in our partnership blinded me to the way he was systematically isolating me from the decision-making process that I had originally built from the ground up. He would bring me stacks of documents to sign after long days at the lab, using my exhaustion as a tool to bypass any thorough scrutiny of the fine print. I believed we were still working toward the same goals for our family, never imagining that the man I loved was already preparing the cage that would eventually trap me. 3 years before our company officially crossed the billion-dollar valuation mark, the invisible cracks in my marriage began to widen into deep canyons of resentment. Grant started pressuring me to appoint his mother, Beatrice Sterling, as the primary manager of our corporate welfare fund under the pretext of family unity. He argued that having a trusted family member oversee our philanthropic efforts would protect our reputation while allowing me to focus entirely on scientific innovation. I initially resisted the idea of bringing Beatrice into the inner circle of Vance Organics because I knew her penchant for luxury far outweighed her interest in organic sustainability. However, Grant used a calculated combination of affection and guilt to wear down my defenses until I finally conceded to his persistent demands. The moment Beatrice took her seat in the office, she began a systematic campaign to undermine my authority through subtle psychological belittlement. She frequently criticized my modest background during high-profile board meetings and suggested that my lack of blue-blooded heritage made me ill-equipped for the social demands of a CEO. Beatrice insisted that I should delegate my operational responsibilities to the men in the room, while I dedicated my energy to frivolous charity galas that had nothing to do with our core mission. Every evening at the dinner table, she made pointed comments about how my professional ambitions were distracting me from being a proper wife to Grant and a present mother to Leo. I found myself trapped between the corporate empire I had built with my own hands and the suffocating expectations of a woman who viewed me as a mere interloper in her family's legacy. My suspicions regarding their true intentions intensified when I accidentally discovered several unexplained disbursements from our family trust being funneled into mysterious offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I confronted Grant in his private study with the financial records in my hand, demanding a transparent explanation for why millions of dollars were moving without my explicit authorization. He maintained a terrifyingly calm demeanor as he produced a stack of sophisticated invoices that supposedly accounted for every cent as legitimate international consulting fees. Grant brushed off my concerns with a patronizing smile, suggesting that my long hours in the laboratory were making me paranoid and causing me to lose sight of the bigger picture. Although the numbers on the page didn't truly align with his verbal explanations, I chose to suppress my instincts for the sake of maintaining a peaceful environment for our young son. During one of our rare private lunches, Genevieve observed the growing tension in my expression and warned me that Grant's financial maneuvers were becoming increasingly aggressive. She had spent decades watching powerful men dismantle the foundations of their wives' successes, and she saw the same predatory patterns emerging within the walls of my own home. Genevieve urged me to start maintaining a secret ledger of every transaction and to quietly secure a team of independent legal advisors who were not beholden to Grant's influence. I listened to her words with a heavy heart, yet the thought of admitting my marriage was failing felt like a defeat I wasn't yet ready to face in public. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder to prove my worth to the Sterling family, the toxicity would eventually dissipate, and we could return to the partnership we once cherished. The final straw that shattered my remaining illusions occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I discovered that Grant had unilaterally altered the legal terms of Leo's inheritance. He had drafted a secret codicil that placed our son's future assets under the sole guardianship of Beatrice in the event of my death or professional incapacitation. This calculated move felt like a direct assault on my basic rights as a mother and a clear indication that Grant was already preparing for a future where I was no longer part of the equation. When I finally confronted him about this betrayal, our living room became a battlefield where he dropped his mask of the supportive husband to reveal the cold manipulator beneath. He shouted that my obsession with the company was making me an unstable parent, and that his mother was far better suited to protect the family's long-term interests than I would ever be. This explosive argument marked the precise moment when I realized that my home was no longer a sanctuary, but a tactical arena where my own family was actively plotting my downfall. I looked into the eyes of the man I had loved for over a decade and realized I was staring at a stranger who valued my empire far more than he valued my life. The realization that Beatrice was whispering poison into his ear every night made me understand that I was fighting a war on two fronts within my own household. I didn't cry or plead for him to change his mind, because I knew the time for reconciliation had long since passed. Instead, I retreated to my son's bedroom and held him close while I made a silent vow that I would dismantle every one of their schemes before they could ever take him away from me. 18 months before the ultimate betrayal destroyed my professional life, the grand halls of our lakeside villa were filled with the deceptive sounds of celebration and false laughter. It was the 10th anniversary of Vance Organics, an evening meant to honor the decade of sacrifice and innovation that had turned my small kitchen experiment into a global powerhouse. My cousin Skyler Miller stood by my side throughout the night, acting as the loyal family member I had personally rescued from financial ruin years prior. I had moved her to Seattle, paid her debts, and eventually promoted her to the position of senior financial consultant within my executive team because I believed blood was the strongest bond. Skyler played the role of the devoted subordinate, perfectly frequently raising her glass to toast my vision, while secretly plotting to dismantle everything I had built with Grant. The glittering facade of the party began to crumble when I noticed Skyler slipping away from the crowded ballroom toward the darkened terrace with a suspicious urgency in her step. I followed her at a discreet distance, expecting to find her taking a professional call, but instead I witnessed her meeting Grant in a secluded corner of the property. The moonlit shadows could not hide the intimate way they stood together, or the cold efficiency with which they discussed a plan to dilute my shares through a complex series of offshore transfers. Grant spoke about me as if I were a mere obstacle to be removed, while Skyler giggled about how easy it had been to manipulate the trust I placed in her. The double betrayal of my husband and my closest cousin felt like a physical blow that left me gasping for air against the cold stone railing of the balcony. The realization that their relationship was not a recent indiscretion, but a long-term affair added a sickening layer of cruelty to the corporate conspiracy they were refining right before my eyes. Skyler had sat at my dinner table every Sunday, played with Leo in our garden, and listened to my deepest fears while she was simultaneously sleeping with my husband. Every supportive text she had sent me during my most stressful work weeks was now revealed as a calculated move to keep me complacent while they drained my influence. I watched them exchange a lingering kiss that confirmed their shared contempt for my presence in the very house my hard work had provided for them. My world shattered in that singular moment of clarity, yet I knew that screaming would only alert them to my discovery before I had the evidence to fight back. Driven by a desperate need for support, I turned to my own parents the following morning, hoping they would provide the sanctuary and guidance I so desperately required. I sat in their sun-drenched living room and laid out the entire situation, begging Mom and Dad to help me navigate the legal and emotional wreckage of Grant's betrayal. To my absolute horror, they did not react with the righteous anger I expected from people who had raised me to be strong and independent. Instead, Mom sighed and suggested that a woman in my position should learn to tolerate a husband's wandering eye for the sake of maintaining the family's prestigious reputation. Dad avoided my gaze entirely, eventually admitting that Grant had been providing them with generous monthly stipends that would disappear if I chose to pursue a scandalous public divorce. The cold realization that my own parents had been bought and paid for by the man destroying my life left me feeling more orphaned than I had ever thought possible. They urged me to quietly transfer the remaining control of the company to Grant in exchange for a peaceful life, effectively asking me to sell my soul to protect their comfort. Their betrayal felt like the final nail in the coffin of my naivety, proving that everyone I loved was more concerned with Grant's checkbook than my personal well-being. I realized then that I was truly alone in this fight, surrounded by predators who wore the masks of family members, while they waited for me to bleed out. I walked out of their house without a single word, knowing that the bridge between us had been burned beyond any possibility of repair or reconciliation. In the silence of my car, I remembered the one man who had always remained outside the toxic circle of the Sterling family's influence. I reached out to my uncle Arthur Vance, a legendary asset recovery lawyer who had spent his career dismantling the very types of financial traps Grant was currently setting. Arthur had always been the black sheep of the family because he refused to play the games of pretense that defined our social circles in Seattle. When I explained the situation to him over a secure line, his voice remained steady and provided the first sense of stability I had felt in months. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to be patient, but instead, he immediately began outlining a strategy to build a shadow dossier on Grant and Skyler's illegal activities. Arthur warned me that the road ahead would require a level of emotional discipline I had never practiced before, as I would have to continue living with my enemies while we gathered the necessary evidence. He began instructing me on how to secretly document every interaction and how to funnel critical data out of the company without triggering Grant's sophisticated surveillance systems. We spent the late hours of the night establishing encrypted communication channels and identifying the specific financial weaknesses in Grant's offshore structures. This was no longer just a battle for my company or my marriage, but a fight for my son's future and my own survival as a human being. I returned to the lake house that night with a cold fire in my heart, ready to play the part of the unsuspecting victim until the moment arrived to strike back. 9 months before the orchestrated tragedy in the boardroom, the silent war within my household transformed into a public campaign aimed at destroying my professional reputation. Grant began working behind the scenes to circulate malicious rumors regarding my supposed mental instability to our major investors and board members. He hired a private investigator to fabricate evidence suggesting that my dedication to the company had spiraled into a dangerous obsession that required medical intervention. I started noticing the suspicious glances from my senior executive team during our weekly strategy sessions, as if they were waiting for me to have a visible breakdown. Grant played the part of the concerned husband perfectly in public, while privately ensuring that every legal avenue was being prepared to strip me of my parental rights. He knew that labeling me as emotionally unfit was the only way he could ever hope to gain full custody of Leo in a future court battle. The situation reached a humiliating peak during a high-stakes business trip to New York City, where I was scheduled to finalize a massive expansion deal with our East Coast partners. As I sat at a prestigious restaurant with several potential investors, my corporate and personal credit cards were suddenly declined one after another without any prior warning. I stood there in absolute silence while the waiter looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, realizing that Grant had officially moved to paralyze my financial independence. I was stranded in a city where I had built a legacy, yet I couldn't even pay for my hotel room because my own husband had locked me out of the empire I founded. The crushing weight of that public embarrassment felt like a carefully aimed arrow, meant to prove my supposed inability to manage my own affairs. During this period of absolute isolation and despair, my best friend Sarah appeared as the only source of genuine support I had left in the world. I had known Sarah since our college days, and she was the only person who saw through the Sterling family's polished exterior to the predatory nature underneath. When I called her from a park bench in Manhattan with tears of frustration in my eyes, she didn't ask questions or tell me to be patient with Grant. Sarah immediately booked me a flight home on her own credit card and provided me with a secure place to stay where Grant's surveillance teams couldn't reach me. She spent countless nights listening to my fears and helping me reorganize my thoughts when I felt like the world was spinning out of control. Her presence in my life during those dark weeks gave me the mental clarity I needed to stop reacting to Grant's provocations and start planning my counteroffensive. While I was staying with Sarah, I received a series of disturbing photographs from the private security firm I had secretly hired to monitor the lake house. The images captured Beatrice arranging a staged scene in Leo's nursery that was clearly designed to look like evidence of my parental neglect. She was planting empty prescription bottles and creating a disorganized environment that would be photographed for a future custody hearing. Beatrice was working in perfect coordination with Grant to ensure that I would lose my son forever if I ever dared to challenge their control over Vance Organics. Seeing the grandmother of my child actively participating in such a vile conspiracy made me realize that I was dealing with people who had no moral boundaries. The betrayal I felt was no longer just about money or business, but about the fundamental safety of my son in a house filled with such calculated malice. I knew that I had to act quickly before Grant could officially move to have me declared legally incompetent through the corrupt medical professionals he had on his payroll. I secretly met with Genevieve at a quiet gallery in the city where we could speak without the fear of being recorded by Grant's sophisticated listening devices. She listened to the latest developments with a grim expression and told me that the time for subtle maneuvering had officially come to an end. Genevieve agreed to help me execute a daring financial move that would effectively place my most valuable assets beyond Grant's reach. We spent the afternoon drafting the documents necessary to transfer my entire portfolio of secret stock options into the Montgomery Fund. This was a private investment vehicle that Genevieve controlled entirely, making it invisible to the auditors Grant was using to track my every move. Transferring my shares to the Montgomery Fund was the most terrifying gamble of my entire career because it meant trusting Genevieve with the entirety of my life's work. I signed the final papers with a shaking hand, knowing that I was effectively making myself look penniless on paper while secretly building a massive war chest for the final confrontation. Grant and Skyler were so preoccupied with tracking my daily spending that they completely missed the massive shift in underlying ownership that was taking place behind the scenes. They truly believed that they had finally broken my spirit, and that I was merely a shadow of the woman who had once built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I returned to the lake house and played the role of the defeated fragile wife, while Arthur Vance worked tirelessly to ensure the legal ironclad nature of my secret transfer. 6 weeks ago, the sudden and unexpected passing of Genevieve sent a seismic shock through the financial elite of Seattle and momentarily threatened to collapse the fragile safety net I had spent months building. Grant and Skyler reacted to the news with a terrifying display of predatory joy, openly celebrating the loss of the only powerful ally who had the influence to challenge their authority. They truly believed that with Genevieve gone, I was finally a defenseless target, with no remaining resources to prevent the total liquidation of Vance Organics. Within hours of the funeral, Grant initiated secret negotiations with our most aggressive competitor to sell the company for a massive cash payout that would allow them to flee the country. They moved with a reckless speed that suggested they were desperate to finalize the transaction before any legal challenges regarding Genevieve's estate could be raised in court. I chose to vanish from the public eye during this period of mourning, relocating to a secluded cabin in a small mountain town to coordinate my final moves with Arthur Vance. We spent our days submerged in a mountain of digital evidence, meticulously tracing the illegal pathways that Grant had used to hide millions of dollars in taxable income over the last decade. Arthur's expertise in asset recovery allowed us to identify the specific offshore accounts where Grant had been siphoning corporate funds to fuel his personal greed. While my enemies thought I was hiding in fear, I was actually forging a legal weapon that would eventually leave them with no room to negotiate. The isolation of the mountains provided the perfect cover for us to finalize a comprehensive dossier that documented every instance of Grant's financial fraud and systematic tax evasion. Back in Seattle, Skyler began to indulge in a lavish lifestyle that was funded entirely by the company's dwindling reserves while she waited for the final sale to be completed. She hosted a series of extravagant parties for the city's social elite, flaunting her newfound power with a level of arrogance that eventually led to her own undoing. During one of her drunken celebrations, she made several catastrophic errors in the annual financial report that she assumed nobody would ever take the time to scrutinize. Her vanity prevented her from seeing the lethal discrepancies she was creating in the corporate records, providing Arthur and me with the exact evidence we needed to prove her complicity in the embezzlement scheme. Skyler was so intoxicated by the prospect of becoming the new queen of the industry that she failed to realize she was handing me the keys to her own prison cell. During this critical time, my sister Audrey Vance became my most valuable source of internal intelligence by remaining inside the Sterling household to observe their private behavior. Audrey had always possessed a quiet and observant nature that allowed her to move unnoticed through the shadows of the lake house while Grant and Beatrice discussed their darkest intentions. She managed to gather dozens of covert audio recordings that captured Grant using extreme emotional violence and verbal threats to maintain his control over my daily life. These recordings provided irrefutable proof of the psychological abuse I had endured, creating a powerful narrative that would resonate deeply in any family court proceeding. Audrey's bravery in risking her own safety to document their cruelty gave me the emotional strength to remain patient while we waited for the perfect moment to execute our plan. As I watched Grant's public confidence grow, I began a secret operation to purchase every single piece of personal debt he had accumulated through his disastrous private real estate investments. He had secretly borrowed tens of millions of dollars from private lenders to fund a series of failing luxury developments in the hope of building his own independent empire apart from my success. Arthur helped me navigate the complex secondary debt market to buy up his high-interest loans through a series of anonymous shell companies that were impossible to trace back to me. Grant had no idea that his primary creditor was no longer a faceless bank, but the very wife he was trying to discard like a piece of useless office furniture. By the time he realized the true nature of his financial vulnerability, I would already hold the legal power to demand immediate repayment of every dollar he owed. I spent the final week of my exile preparing the physical evidence that would be presented during the upcoming merger meeting where Grant intended to sign away my life's work. We compiled the tax fraud records, the embezzlement evidence, the abuse recordings, and the debt purchase agreements into a single lethal presentation. Arthur assured me that the legal framework we had built was flawless and that Grant's arrogance had left him completely exposed to a total catastrophic failure. I looked at the photos of Leo that Audrey sent me every night and promised myself that the era of the Sterling family's shadow over our lives was about to reach a violent end. The gray fog of Seattle was waiting for my return, but this time I was not coming back as a victim searching for mercy, but as a vengeful ghost ready to reclaim her throne. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open on Monday morning, just as Grant was preparing to sign the final documents that would have sold my entire life's work to our competitors. He sat at the head of the table with a pen in his hand and a look of triumphant arrogance, completely unaware that the woman he had tried to destroy was standing right behind him. I walked into the room with a renewed sense of authority that seemed to freeze the very air, forcing every shareholder to stare in stunned silence at my sudden reappearance. Grant's face drained of all color as he stammered an incoherent question about how I had gained access to the building after he had personally revoked my security clearance. I didn't bother answering his desperate inquiry because the time for explanations had long since passed and the hour of his public downfall had finally arrived. I calmly placed a certified copy of Genevieve's final will and testament on the table, which officially named me as the sole owner of the very conglomerate that was currently attempting to purchase Vance Organics. The room erupted into a chaotic murmur of confusion as the board members realized that I was now effectively the employer of everyone involved in this hostile takeover. Grant tried to dismiss the legal documents as elaborate forgeries, but the presence of Arthur Vance by my side lent an undeniable weight of legitimacy to my startling announcement. I watched with cold satisfaction as the realization slowly dawned on Skyler that the massive payout she had been dreaming of was disappearing like smoke in a windstorm. They had spent months trying to push me out of my own company only to discover that I had returned as the master of their destiny. The situation grew even more dire for Grant when Arthur stepped forward to announce that a special task force from the federal tax authorities had just issued a freezing order on all his personal assets. Every offshore account and shell company that he had used to hide his stolen wealth was now under the total control of the government, pending a massive investigation into international money laundering. Grant's hands began to tremble as he realized that the financial fortress he had built on a foundation of lies was being dismantled in a matter of seconds. He looked around the room for an ally among the shareholders he had once bribed, but they all avoided his gaze like he was a leper whose touch would bring their own destruction. The predator had finally become the prey trapped in a cage of his own making while the entire corporate world watched his humiliating demise. Before Grant could even attempt to defend his actions, two uniformed security officers entered the room and approached Skyler with a warrant for her immediate arrest on multiple counts of securities fraud. I watched her usual mask of sophisticated arrogance shatter into a million pieces of pure terror as she was led away from the table in handcuffs in front of the people she had tried to impress. She pleaded with Grant to help her, but he was too busy trying to calculate his own survival to spare even a single glance for the woman who had been his partner in betrayal. The poetic justice of seeing her dragged out of the building she had tried to steal from me provided a sense of closure that I had been waiting for since that night on the balcony. Skyler's desperate cries echoed through the hallway long after the doors had closed, serving as a grim warning to anyone else who considered crossing the woman they had so dangerously underestimated. I turned my attention back to the remaining board members and projected a series of incriminating documents onto the large screen that detailed the extensive criminal cooperation between Beatrice and her son. The records showed how they had systematically used our corporate welfare funds to launder money through a network of fraudulent charities that existed only on paper for the purpose of tax evasion. Beatrice had been the primary architect of these financial maneuvers, thinking that her social status in Seattle would protect her from any serious legal scrutiny. I watched Grant's remaining composure evaporate as he saw the irrefutable evidence that would eventually send both him and his mother to federal prison for a very long time. There was no longer any room for denial or manipulation, because every lie they had ever told was now laid bare in the cold light of the boardroom. The absolute collapse of Grant's world was completed when I handed him the legal notices for the immediate repayment of the tens of millions of dollars in personal debt that I now owned through my shadow companies. He looked at the signature on the debt purchase agreements and realized that he owed his entire future to the wife he had publicly labeled as mentally unstable and unfit to lead. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming as I watched him sink into his chair, a broken man who had lost his company, his mistress, his reputation, and his freedom, all in a single hour. He tried to speak, perhaps to offer a pathetic apology or to beg for a shred of mercy, but I simply turned my back on him to address the board of directors. I told them that the era of the sterling influence was officially over, and that Vance Organics would be rebuilt under my sole leadership starting today. 1 month has passed since the heavy gavel of justice finally came down on the individuals who once believed they could dismantle my life with impunity. The federal courtroom in Seattle became the stage for a total collapse of the Sterling dynasty, as the evidence we gathered left no room for any legal maneuver or plea bargain. Grant sat in the defendant's chair with a hollow expression as the judge officially stripped him of his license to practice law for the rest of his natural life. He was handed a lengthy prison sentence for a long list of crimes, including systematic financial fraud and the cold-blooded embezzlement of corporate funds. I watched from the front row as he was led away in shackles, realizing that the man who once demanded my absolute submission was now reduced to a mere number in the federal penal system. His reputation and the immense fortune he tried to steal have vanished entirely, leaving him with nothing but the cold reality of a concrete cell and the crushing weight of his own failures. Skyler Miller fared no better than the man she had conspired with, as she found herself completely bankrupt and permanently blacklisted from every reputable financial institution in the country. The industry she once hoped to conquer has collectively turned its back on her, ensuring that she will never again hold a position of influence or trust within the business world. Every bridge she burned and every lie she told has come back to haunt her in the form of total social and professional isolation. She was forced to watch as her remaining luxury assets were liquidated to pay for the massive legal fees and restitution orders that resulted from her criminal participation in the merger plot. Skyler now exists as a cautionary tale for those who value greed over loyalty, wandering through a city that no longer recognizes her name or her face. There is a profound sense of poetic justice in knowing that her ambition led her directly into a void where her voice no longer carries any weight or authority. The fallout of the scandal also reached the matriarch of the family, as Beatrice was forced to sell her remaining properties and family heirlooms to settle the astronomical fines imposed by the tax authorities. She, who once prided herself on being the gatekeeper of Seattle's high society, now spends her final years in a state of quiet poverty and total public rejection. The social circles that once clamored for her attention have now discarded her with the same cold efficiency she once used against me during our years of domestic conflict. Beatrice is left to reflect on the destruction she helped facilitate while living in a modest apartment that is a far cry from the grandeur of the Sterling estate. No one calls her for tea or invites her to the prestigious galas she once dominated, because her name has become synonymous with the corruption that nearly destroyed Vance Organics. She is a woman haunted by the ghosts of her own arrogance, left to wither away in the shadows of a world that has moved on without her. I moved with a clinical precision to finalize my divorce from Grant, ensuring that the legal process was as swift and absolute as the collapse of his professional career. The court granted me sole and permanent custody of Leo after hearing the irrefutable evidence of the emotional abuse and neglect orchestrated by the Sterling family. I felt a tremendous sense of liberation the moment I signed the final decree that officially restored my original surname and removed the Sterling title from our lives forever. Leo will grow up knowing only the strength of his mother's legacy rather than the toxic shadow of a father who viewed him as a strategic asset. Every document and every digital record linking my son to that family has been purged, allowing us to begin our new chapter with a clean slate and a clear conscience. The weight that had been pressing down on my shoulders for years has finally lifted, replaced by a deep and unwavering sense of internal peace and professional clarity. Vance Organics has emerged from the storm stronger than ever before, with our stock prices reaching record highs as investors respond to the news of our renewed corporate integrity. I have spent the last few weeks restructuring the executive board to ensure that the transparency and ethical standards I value are woven into the very fabric of our operation. The betrayal we endured has served as a catalyst for a total transformation, turning a vulnerable billion-dollar company into a resilient global empire that cannot be easily shaken. My employees now work with a sense of purpose and security that was missing during the years when Grant was secretly siphoning away our collective resources. We are no longer just a business, but a testament to the fact that innovation and honesty can survive even the most calculated attempts at destruction. The scars of the past are still visible if one looks closely enough, but they now serve as a reminder of the battle we won rather than the pain we suffered. I stood on the glass balcony of our brand new headquarters earlier this evening, looking out over the shimmering lights of the city as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Audrey joined me at the railing, her quiet presence providing a sense of comfort that reminded me of how far we have come since those dark days of surveillance and fear. She looked out at the horizon and commented on how bright the future appeared, now that the clouds of the Sterling influence had finally dissipated into the atmosphere. We stood there in a comfortable silence, two sisters who had survived a war and emerged with their spirits and their legacy completely intact. The air felt different tonight, carrying the scent of salt from the bay and the promise of a life that is no longer dictated by the whims of a predator. I realized then that my journey was never just about saving a company, but about reclaiming the woman I was always meant to be before the world tried to tell me I was small. Looking back at the wreckage of my past, the most vital lesson I have learned is the non-negotiable importance of maintaining absolute financial independence and having a rigorous legal contingency plan in every marital relationship. Trust is a beautiful foundation for a home, but it must never serve as a reason to hand over the keys of your life's work to someone who might one day use them against you. Modern women must recognize that patience combined with a strategic mind is the most powerful weapon available when navigating the treacherous waters of family betrayals and corporate conspiracies. I realized that my survival depended not on my ability to shout, but on my discipline to remain silent while I systematically built a fortress of evidence that no lie could ever penetrate. I want to extend my deepest and most sincere gratitude to every single one of you who stayed with me until the final moments of this journey to witness my path toward justice. Your unwavering support has been a source of strength as I recounted the painful chapters of my life, from the initial betrayal to the ultimate victory in the boardroom. I would truly love to hear your personal perspectives on how I handled the Sterling family, and whether you would have chosen a different strategy in my position. Please do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you can stay updated on many more dramatic and empowering stories in the future.